if I can actually.
So I would like to start, Nadia, just by asking you to explain your main roles as the Consul General of Canada in Atlanta.
Yes, absolutely. So just to say thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to see you, Mike. Sadly, it's not in person this time, but very, very happy to be here with everybody and have the opportunity to engage with you all. So basically, as Canada's Consul General to the Southeast USA, based in Atlanta, I am Canada's senior diplomatic representative across 6 states of the Southeast USA. So that's Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And grosso modo, in large terms, myself and my team, we are responsible for promoting and strengthening and maintaining the bilateral relationship between Canada and the 6 states for which I am accredited. And that is both on the business side, so whether it's helping Canadian companies that are looking to export to the Southeast USA, or helping American companies who are looking to expand and want to consider Canada as a place to grow their business. As you know, the CanadaUS supply chain network is something that is very much integrated. Or whether that's promoting Canadian culture, promoting Canadian values, especially here in the Southeast USA, we have a lot in common, Canada and the United States. So oftentimes we can work together to promote shared values, shared vision for things out in the world, and I work to make those connections as well. So that's in a nutshell what I do. And then, of course, what's most important for my government especially is the part of the job that's all about helping Canadians who are based here, visiting here in the Southeast USA. And, you know, as we have just gone through major evacuations around the world because of COVID-19, that has become ever more important for my consular team. We call that consular services. And so that's a big part of what we do, helping Canadians who are visiting the Southeast USA who might need consular assistance.
I'd also like to add that some of you on the call probably are some of the folks who signed up to go to Ottawa with us in May of this year. And Nadia and her team were instrumental in making this happen. And we've had to postpone until next summer. But without Nadia's help and Ash's help in her office, we would have not been able to do it. So we're looking forward to visiting Ottawa, where you're from, in 2021. So my next question is how long you've been in your current role, and how do you arrive at a position like this? What's your background like educationally?
Yeah, so I was appointed in September of 2017. So I am going on into my 4th year here. I've been here for 3 years now. And, you know, my background, I'll tell you what my background is, but I will preface it by saying that the Canadian diplomatic corps, much like the American diplomatic corps, is made up of people with a diverse set of backgrounds. So my particular path was a law degree and then a master's degree in political science with a concentration in international trade. But, you know, that I have to say is just happenstance, because we have many people who are part of the Foreign Service who are engineers by background, who did business degrees, medical degrees, art degrees, historians. We've got it all. And, you know, I have to say that as we also think of the future of diplomacy, sort of diplomacy in the 21st century, as we come hopefully sooner rather than later, on the other side of COVID and what diplomacy looks like, people with medical backgrounds and backgrounds that aren't necessarily often thought of as, you know, close to diplomacy become ever more important. And so my background is in law and political science and international trade, but many people join the department with a diverse set of backgrounds.
Okay. You mentioned in your first response a little bit about how the U.S. and Canadian countries are linked economically. Can you spend a little time explaining just how intertwined the Canadian and U.S. economies are during normal times?
Yes, yeah. I love this question because it always amazes me how many people don't necessarily understand the depth and breadth of the Canada-US relationship. So it is a $1 trillion business between Canada and the United States, trillions of dollars. I use the nugget that $1.4 million of goods and services, $1.4 million of goods and services go across the Canada-US border, and wait for it, every minute of every day.
Wow.
$1.4 million worth of goods and services every minute of every day. And so there, you know, sometimes people think it sounds Pollyannish or it sounds, you know, quaint, but it is true. There is no other relationship quite like the Canada-US relationship. There is no other bilateral relationship like ours. We are, you know, bound together, not just by geography, not just by common values, but really the integrated supply chains that we have managed to develop between our countries has created hundreds of thousands of jobs across each and every state and each and every province of our two countries. You know, Canada is the United States' #1 customer, which means that in the vast majority of places across the United States, the people that buy American goods the most is Canada. And, you know, oftentimes people forget about us because we're maybe not as sexy as some of the other far-flung places. And I like to say that it's a testament to the ease of our relationship that oftentimes people forget that we are actually a foreign country, right? We are actually, when people talk about a foreign relationship, you often talk about Europe or Asia or somewhere, you know, crossed seas. But, you know, your relationship with Canada is indeed a foreign relationship, and it is the most important relationship, and vice versa. We depend on each other extraordinarily. And you know, and I know we're talking mostly about business here, but I think it's worth mentioning as well that the relationship that we have with regards to our shared values and our shared way of moving in the world that we have managed throughout the decades to work together on in various international fora has also been something that has ultimately driven our economic success as well. And I think that that's important to say as well. The security relationship, for example, that we have is something that is envied. You know, we are the only two countries, we have the longest, unmilitarized border ever, anywhere, Canada and the United States. And especially in these times, that's, you know, that's quite something.
Definitely. If you could sort of take the idea of Canada being, you know, such a great trading partner of the United States and bring it down to your area in the Southeast and specifically Georgia, how big of an economic impact is this relationship having on Georgia specifically, and then more so in the Southeast?
Yeah, so again, I mean, the relationship in the Southeast and in Georgia really mirrors the relationship at the federal level, so to speak, at the country level. So Canada is Georgia's #1 customer. So we buy more from Georgia than any other country in the world. The relationship between the trade and investment relationship between Canada and Georgia is responsible for tens of thousands of jobs in Georgia and in the Southeast USA. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. I always use the example of DecoStar, which is in Carrollton, Georgia, that many of you might be aware of. That is actually a Canadian company, a company that was born and raised in Ontario, my home province, and, you know, employs thousands of people, not just in Georgia, but across the Southeast USA. And so that's but one example, frankly, of many companies that have come and expanded here in Georgia and in the Southeast USA. And I would have to say as well that it's not just, in my humble opinion, it's not just about companies necessarily that have expanded here in Georgia or in the Southeast USA. We have a lot of Canadian entrepreneurs that have come to Georgia, come to the Southeast USA for whatever reason, whether it was for a job or whether it was for education or whether it was because, again, you know, they came on a family vacation and lo and behold, this became their favorite spot to vacation, and then they met somebody and decided to stay, right? That's often a story that I hear. And then they create businesses here that are Georgia born, right? That are Southeast USA born. So I think of Springbot, an Atlanta company that's done very well in the tech space and has won many awards across Atlanta and across at the state level as well, owned and operated by a Canadian. Him and his wife are born and raised in just outside of Toronto, Ontario, moved to Atlanta probably about 15 years ago now, and created this company, Springbot, that has become wildly successful, that has grown to a small operation that employed about 10 to 20 people, that now has over 100 employees. And so those are the kind of examples that really, to me, demonstrate the breadth of our relationship and the intertwining of our relationship. And the impact, like you said, the footprint, that's a bit more complicated than just a company coming here, you know, expanding, setting up shop. We are really truly integrated as a people as well.
Okay. Obviously, we're facing some rather difficult times right now. If you could talk a little bit about how the Canadian government has responded to the COVID crisis in terms of supporting its workers in Canada and its businesses in Canada. And specifically, if you could talk a little bit about the Canada Emergency Response Benefit.
Yes.
And the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy programs.
Yes. Did you look those up?
I did, researching this because
that's great.
It just seems like the Canadian government is taking a little bit of different approach than our government has been taking during this particular time.
Well, you know what, I will, full disclosure, I will have to admit, which is actually kind of unusual to me, but I do admit that I've been having information overload. And so I have really only focused on the Canadian relief efforts. And so I will fully admit and be very transparent with everybody who's watching now or who may watch the recording, that I am less versed in the American response. But I can certainly talk to you about the Canadian response, which is vast and ever changing, I have to say. But what I will start with by saying, just in terms of context, is that, you know, the Canadian approach, to me, has been based on a few fundamental factors, a few fundamental truths, so to speak. Number one, I would say, and you know, we are all economists, or in my case, economist wannabes. And so, you know, the first thing that I would say that our response is based on is the very simple macroeconomic policy or macroeconomic fact that health is really a negative externality, right? When anybody who done, you know, macroeconomics 101, or even in microeconomics, frankly, you learn that there are certain externalities and certain negative externalities for which the market cannot and really should not regulate. And health is one of those. And I think that the Canadian government and the response has really sort of use that as a North Star, no pun intended, in terms of the response. So health and safety, and the fact that the market cannot really regulate that because of it being a negative externality. Number two, fundamental, is the importance of coordination. So we are a Confederate nation, right? In Canada. And so we have a federal level, and then we have provincial, sub-federal levels, all of whom have different responsibilities under the Constitution. Health is actually a provincial responsibility in Canada. It's not regulated at the federal level. And so there has been a concerted effort in Canada to coordinate with the provincial level and even at the municipal level as well. So this idea of coordination has also been something that has been very important. And then in terms of the CERB, and then in terms of what we have done for businesses, again, the CERB was designed really to, and the Prime Minister said this very, very bluntly, reach as many people as possible in Canada, as fast as possible, with as little bureaucratic layer as possible. So it is a direct benefit to Canadians. It is a $2,000 benefit that goes to Canadians every 4 weeks for up to 16 weeks, I think, but don't quote me on that. Yeah, up to 16 weeks, I'm pretty sure. So $2,000 every 4 weeks for up to 16 weeks that goes directly to people, to qualified Canadians. And the qualifications have actually ebbed and flowed throughout the past several weeks. And I say ebbed and flowed because it has changed in order to provide the maximum benefit to the maximum number of people. And so that's the benefit that's aimed at people, vulnerable people, people who are affected, they've lost their jobs, or they've had to stop working because they're taking care of somebody who is ill, etc. It is meant to provide them with money in their pocket. And then on the business side, you know, we have really worked to do two things, I would say. Number one, to keep employees attached to their employers, attached to their companies, because we know that once companies lay off people, obviously the economic impact for employees is great. But it is also much harder then to restart up that company when the time comes. So that's number one. And then number two, to make sure that those supply chains that are so important for our prosperity and our economic advancement does not disintegrate. So making sure that we maintain those supply chains. And so in that regard, the government has introduced a wage subsidy, which is really for employers to use. So qualified employers can apply for this wage subsidy that allows them to get money from the government that helps them to continue to employ and pay their employees.
Has this been, I guess, has it gone relatively smoothly, this relationship between the provincial and the you know?
Yeah, so I feel like I'm being disingenuous because I'm tooting my own horn, but I'm really not. I'm really being sincere when I say that it has. And, you know, because we are, because of the nature of our country and the separation of powers between the provincial government and the federal government, you know, being completely transparent with everybody, there are times where the relationship between the federal government and the provincial governments have been difficult. You know, there is no doubt about it. Don't let anybody tell you any differently, you know? And frankly, I would say even up to the week before this whole thing started, the relationship between the federal government and the provincial governments in certain areas were very, very difficult. You know, as is the case with every federation, I think, and especially with one that has this clear separation of powers like Canada does. However, faced with a global pandemic that has really affected all Canadians, and understanding that the guiding star for our response is really about the health and safety in the broad sense, so both economically and health, core health-wise, is number one of importance. The federal government and the provincial governments have really come together. They have daily calls. The Prime Minister has a daily press conference that is broadcast nationwide, followed by daily broadcasts, updates by provincial governments, and by public servants as well. And, you know, they have really committed to working together. And we have seen incredible acts of cooperation between provinces. So the famous story that has been that hit the news was when Alberta, who has managed to plank the curve a little bit faster than perhaps others, especially those in Ontario and Quebec, and they found themselves with extra equipment. They found themselves with extra N95 masks and gloves. They packaged it all up and shipped it off to Ontario and Quebec for their use. So, you know, just one very, very small example of the level of cooperation and understanding that has happened between the provincial governments.
It is nice to hear. I wish we could import some of that.
Like I said, it's not always like that, you know, it's not always like that. It infamously, you know, it made the news when our Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, said to one of the reporters in response to a question, you know, how's it going with the provinces? She said, Doug Ford, who is the Premier of Ontario, many of you might know that and remember his brother, she said, he's my therapist. We talk every day, several times a day, and he has become my best friend and my therapist. And people thought, wow, okay, the times are changing, you know? So, yeah.
All right, that's good. Are there any particular Canadian businesses or industries that have been sort of affected by this COVID-19 pandemic more than others?
Yeah, you know, I would say that when we think about companies that have been affected, it is the sectors that we can all sort of guess, right? The tourism companies. And when I say affected, let's talk negatively first, and then let's talk about some of the success stories that we've seen, right? The innovation that's come out of this, because I think that's important to highlight as well. So the tourism industry, of course, absolutely devastated. And that includes not just sort of hotels and base tourism companies, but our airlines. We all know, I mean, Atlanta knows this more than ever with Delta and the airport that has really, you know, grinded to a halt for the most part, right? And so our airlines have done the same thing back home, which has devastated the tourism industry. And the Canadian government has provided support for those industries. I would always also say, of course, our energy sector, our oil and gas sector in Canada, you know, is facing a double whammy, right? Because, you know, we all know what's happening with our dear friends in the Middle East and how they are trying to regulate the price of oil. And that started before this crisis, right? Before the global pandemic. But now, coupled with this global pandemic, that is a double whammy for our oil and gas industry. And so they are being hit very hard in a time where they were already under an enormous amount of downward pressure in their industry. You know, I would also, though, say that we have seen quite a level of innovation from some companies that have really geared up and pivoted their production and their manufacturing to produce PPEs and to start producing rapid testing for the COVID virus, right? Famously, many of you know about Blue Dot, which is the Canadian company, tech company, AI company that predicted that the COVID virus was going to be coming fast and furious, sort of a few weeks before many did in Wuhan. And so they are an example of a Canadian company that, because of their innovation, has really been at the forefront of helping us get on the other side of COVID-19.
All right, I'm guessing every single teacher on this call is wondering about this next question. What is going on with Canadian schools? Is it virtual like it is?
Yes. So again, much like in America, education is also a provincial responsibility. Section 92 of our Constitution. It is a provincial responsibility. So the response with regards to schools isn't necessarily the same across provinces, across the country. But what is the same is that schools are closed. So all schools are closed. And all schools have gone to some sort of virtual learning, online learning, distance learning, whatever it is that you'd like to call it. How that is undertaken is a little bit different depending on what province you are in. But most provinces, I couldn't find for all provinces and territories, but most provinces and territories have some sort of face-to-face virtual learning option, where at least sometime during the week, the children have the opportunity to interact virtually through video conferencing with their teachers, and then coupled with online learning portals, material being sent to home to parents to print off and practice with their children. Ontario, for example, just bought, don't quote me on the number, but I think it's 90,000 iPads and internet connection, internet for mobile internet for students that otherwise wouldn't have, that don't have the means, that might not have iPads and internet connection at home. So the provincial government funded that for 90,000 students. And so there is across the country a move towards virtual learning, with the expectation that will continue through to the end of the school year, which for us is the end of June. So in Canada, school starts in September and ends in June, pretty much across the country.
Okay. Changing direction a little bit here. Can you give us your thoughts on the recently ratified United States-Mexico-Canada agreement?
Yes.
In what way or ways is this trade agreement better for the Canada-US trade relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. My view is that I'm very excited. I'm very excited that we have all passed the agreement through our respective parliaments. I'll use the Canadian terminology, and are now in the process of doing the necessary legislative work to bring our rules and regulations and our laws into effect that will allow our companies to start benefiting from the agreement. I think it's fantastic. Those of you who have seen me speak before about our trade relationship know that I am, a trade policy wonk at heart. And I truly believe that, frankly, I believe that the North American Free Trade Agreement was a very good agreement. That is the reason why Canada, the United States, and Mexico are economic powerhouses. And that the North American region, as an economic region, competes and wins around the world against our, European and Asian competitors time and time again. We are the envy of the world, frankly, and I think it is in large part because of the supply chains and the integration that we have managed to create through that trade agreement. But it was 20 years old. When NAFTA was negotiated, the internet is not what it is today. E-commerce was not what it is today, if anything at all. The way that companies do business abroad has changed. The makeup of our businesses has changed. And so we needed to update the agreement to take into account the realities of the 21st century. And I think that the agreement does that. It really, again, tightens up some of the some of the rules around our automotive, for example, relationship, to ensure that the benefits that we enjoy as a trading bloc stays within our trading bloc, right? We have taken on the responsibility of that trading relationship. And so we should reap the benefits, and we should try and ensure that there are no free riders to the extent possible, right? And I think that the trade agreement tried to do that. And it also has provisions that will hopefully seek to encourage our continued engagement with small businesses that are really the backbone of all three of our economies. And, you know, the trade agreement, the new trade agreement, the USMCA, recognizes that and really calls for us to work together as an economic bloc to try and support our small businesses in any way that we can, through information sharing, through learning through each other, and through ensuring that our regulations are as transparent and easy to navigate as possible.
How popular is the USMCA in Canada? If you could sort of give me a generalization.
Well, that is almost a trick question, I have to say. Listen, what I say to people is that Canada is a trading nation. We are a big country with a relatively small population, right? 1/10 of the population of the United States. With a climate that is such that if we want to enjoy strawberries year round, we need to trade, right? We depend on trade for our economic, jokes aside, we really do depend on trade for our economic growth and our economic prosperity. There is just no two ways about it. And when NAFTA was negotiated in the 90s, we had our existential debate nationwide about trade and whether it was a good thing or not. And we landed on the side of it is a good thing. And so you will be hard pressed to find large groups of people in Canada that don't think that trade and trade with the United States and Mexico in particular are of benefit to our country. There are people who will question whether what we have negotiated is the best thing to negotiate, whether we could have gotten more, whether we gave away too much, whether we should have stronger provisions in there for labor and environment, which we did do in the USMCA, by the way. And so there are absolutely those debates about how we go about trading and how we go about operationalizing a trade agreement. But the very question of whether there should be a trade agreement with Canada, the United States, and Mexico, you will get very few people who question whether that is a benefit or not in Canada.
Okay. Final question from me, and then as we said earlier, we'll turn the questions over to the teachers. Where do you see the Canada-US trade relationship in 10 years?
Where do I see the relationship in 10 years? I have to say that and I'll explain myself, I see it in the same place that it is today. And I say that because I think that it's important to realize that our relationship is one that is so stable and so integrated and has really deep roots that transcend me, you, the people in the governor's office here or any other state, the people in Washington, the people in Ottawa. It transcends all of those relationships, frankly. And so in 10 years, no matter what has happened in the world, the Canada-United States relationship will be as strong, as important, and as integrated as it is today, no matter what. So I really do think that time is going to have, and the ebbs and flows of time will have minimal impact on a relationship that is really like no two other relationships, no other relationship in the world between two countries, and will continue to be the most important bilateral relationship between any two countries.
Okay, that's good news. I'm glad to hear that.
Yes.
All right, Chris.
Yeah,
Turn.
I got a couple of questions from a few teachers here. Brian Wallace in Fulton County, and you sort of just touched on this, so this is more of a follow-up
Okay.
to what you were just talking about. This is a fairly broad question here. Are Canadians, so not necessarily from the government level, but the citizen level, are Canadians beginning to view, in your opinion, the US-Canada relationship in a different light given recent political and economic tensions? And then as a follow-up, he says, would you say are the priorities for Canadians in managing and maintaining this relationship you just described moving forward? That's a big one.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm going to be honest. And when this recording goes live and other people see it, if you then no longer see me here, you'll know that I got in trouble for being honest. So yeah. You know, it has been a difficult few years in the Canada-US relationship. And I'm being honest because I think it's disingenuous, and I think that people would just kind of roll their eyes if I said anything differently and, know that I wasn't telling the truth. All you got to do is, read the paper or follow social media to know that. I think that Canadians, and again, we're not talking necessarily about government level or government officials like myself, but Canadians, were very surprised during the modernization of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And for many of them, it opened their eyes, maybe is the wrong way of saying it, but it was a shock, frankly. Because I think that many of them had a view of the Canada-US relationship that was one of deep friendship, and one that was special in nature, such that, we were really integrated in a way that we understood the importance of the relationship and would not jeopardize that in any way for anything, and that we had sort of a privileged relationship with each other because of the fact that we have gone to war together, that our soldiers fight, side by side together, that we have the only shared bilateral space command in NORAD between any two countries. That doesn't happen between any two countries, but it does between Canada and the United States. The person who shut down American airspace during 9/11 so that no further planes could cause further horror was a Canadian. And then afterwards, Canada took in all of those planes in Gander, Newfoundland. Many of you now know that it's a famous Broadway play, Come From Away. And so all of those things for Canadians really meant something. And to see how the negotiations played out in public was difficult. I won't kind of try and sugarcoat it. It was very difficult. And then most recently, of course, with COVID-19, with the issues that we had with some of the contracts of sharing PPE and protective equipment, that was also, and I say this openly because our premiers, some of our provincial leaders, so the equivalent of a governor, our premiers were very vocal about it. They were very upset. Because the raw material that goes into making a lot of that personal protection equipment comes from Canada, and we are sharing it freely with our American friends. And we thought that the same wasn't necessarily being reciprocated, and so it has been difficult. Do not get me wrong. But what I will say is that again, the relationship really does transcend any one trade dispute that we have, any one trade modernization process that we go through. And at the heart of it, we are family. And, you know, many people say to me, and I often say to people, yeah, we're like family. Sometimes you want to throw each other out the window, you know? And, you know, many times, you know, we're always looking forward to Thanksgiving dinner, but, you know, an hour and a half in, we're like, okay, when is everybody leaving? You know? So much like family is the relationship between Canada and the United States. At the end of the day, we are friends, partners, and allies. At the end of the day, we need each other. We rely on each other. There is no other country I know that the United States would look to for their security and their needs with regards to security, and vice versa. And of course, the trade relationship we already spoke about. And so at the end of the day, we are friends, partners, and allies, and nothing will change that.
Awesome. Thank you. That's a very well thought out answer. I appreciate that. Becky Rickley from Fayette County has more of a statement, but there's a question embedded in here that I think is interesting. All right, so the statement is, I buy rice that is packaged in Canada. I don't imagine it is grown there, but I keep hoping the production doesn't stop with COVID-19 concerns because it's the only rice my family will eat.
What rice is that?
Yeah, Becky, what rice is that?
I'm embarrassed to say it's the Uncle Ben's steaming bag.
It is? Okay, I knew it.
The 90-second rice.
I love it.
Not a gourmet.
Listen, Uncle Ben's is a staple. Who doesn't like Uncle Ben's?
There you go. I didn't know that, so I just learned something too.
I love it. I love it. I love it. It will not stop. Okay, sorry, yes.
Yeah, but embedded in that was to me an interesting question. We had a virtual workshop on here a couple of weeks ago about just international trade in general under the current situation, and we talked briefly at the end of it about countries putting voluntary export restraints on, like things they wouldn't allow to be exported. Do you know of anything other than that? Like, obviously rice is still getting exported, but are there things that Canada's like, oh no, we're holding on to these?
No.
Medical devices, stuff like that I'm thinking of.
Yeah, no. So in fact, the issue that we had a few weeks ago was with regards to some personal protection equipment, PPEs, and it was an export restriction that the United States had placed that they extended. We thought, you know, obviously Canada would be exempt because of our supply chains that are integrated, but we were not. But Canada has not put on any export restrictions with regards to our American friends and neighbors, nor do we hope to. You know, especially when it comes to food and what do you call it? Personal products, you know, toilet paper and all the rest of it. You know, there's a lot of talk about toilet paper these days. You know, the supply chain between Canada and the United States is actually very important. And we have made a very strong commitment to ensure that those supply chains are maintained. And it's one of the reasons why when Canada and the United States decided to limit all non-essential travel between our two borders, in order to try and plank the curve, we were very specific that essential included anything and anybody that had to go across the border for the purposes of maintaining our trading relationship. So the truck drivers, for example, continue to go across the border and bring products back and forth between our two borders, just like they did before.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Tiffany Fannin from Cobb County, this might be a broader question too, had a specific, do you know the percentage of Canadians that are being tested and or tracked for COVID? And then as the follow-up to that, I would ask, like, what is the, like, culturally, what is the feeling about, like, we had Governor Kemp yesterday, talked a lot about tracking. How does that play in Canada versus here?
Yeah, so I will admit, maybe I should know the number off by heart, but I don't.
No.
I could look it up for you because it's in fact in my sit rep that I get every day, but I didn't memorize it, so I apologize for that. But just like Governor Kemp and just like across the United States, there has been a very strong emphasis on testing and tracking. Health Canada has recently approved several Canadian companies, I want to say 3, but don't quote me on the number, companies that have invented rapid testing that are now approved by Health Canada for use across the country and are being deployed across the country. One of them comes from my hometown, Ottawa. So so there has been a concerted effort to fast track these approvals and to get testing to as many people as possible. And I think that around the world we have recognized that testing and tracking is important. You know, but I would say that, and this again is world according to Nadia. So this is not Government of Canada speaking, it's world according to Nadia. I say often to people, you know, the old adage, who wants change? And everybody kind of raises their hand. And then you say, who wants to change? And everybody's kind of like, for you, maybe you should change, you know? And the same thing kind of applies when it comes to tracking, in particular. Testing, you know, I'm sure that everybody would line up for a test, but tracking, and often people point to some other countries like Taiwan and other places that have been able to track people effectively and plank the curve more effectively. But they fail to mention that in many of these places, you know, they aren't liberal democracies. And, you know, they track people and they don't have to ask their permission. They just put something in, you know, they just set up things and then they're tracked, right? You know, it is much harder for liberal democracies to do that. And, you know, while everybody talks about tracking and asks the questions of all of the politicians, both in Canada and the United States, you know, what are you doing to track better? As soon as the government talks about ways that they could track, i.e., you know, let's, you know, again, this is not Government of Canada. The Government of Canada has not said this for any Canadians watching. You know, let's do what some other countries have done and put a chip somewhere that then plugs into your phone. We don't have to ask your permission, and so we know exactly where you've been and where you went, and so then we can say to you, oh, you didn't go to the grocery store, you were in the park, you were at the beach, you know, wherever you were, and yeah, we can track that way, absolutely. You know, and then then it gets a little bit, yeah, nobody wants that. So it's complicated, I guess, is my answer. And Canada, much like the United States, is trying to do the best that we can within the parameters of the liberal democracy that we all live in and enjoy living in.
Fantastic. Got a great question here from Laura Perry, and this is something I hadn't considered. I'm just going to read it as it's written. Many Canadian snowbirds spend winters in the US. The healthcare system has criteria for those travelers to enable them to come south. How do you see this COVID crisis impacting that process in the future?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So most of my time over the past several weeks was actually dealt with getting Canadians back home. So
Oh, wow.
Canadian snowbirds, Miami is not part of my territory, but my colleague in Miami and my team was helping them. They were basically getting the snowbirds back home because, as you rightly said, you know, the insurance was very clear that they're not covered for anything COVID related. So we had a big, huge repatriation exercise that we had to undertake because of that. And, you know, it remains to be seen how that affects tourism and the snowbirds in the fuwill I think, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, because there's sort of a follow-up to what you just said. Pam Roach from Cobb County asked, so will a lot of those decisions, is that provincial and sub-provinces, or is it done by nationwide, or?
So the decisions with regards to insurance?
It just says Canadian plans for the future in general. I guess just answer it in general terms.
Yeah, so Canadian plans in the future with regards to tourism.
Oh,
like
she said specifically to COVID-19.
Our response to COVID?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So our response to COVID, again, depending on what what area we're talking about, is both federal and provincial.
Okay.
So things related to healthcare is all under the purview of the provincial governments, but again, large amount of coordination at the federal level as well. When it comes to economic relief programs, there are federal programs like the CERB program and the wage subsidy program. and other programs that have been put in place for students, for our Indigenous populations that I didn't necessarily talk about in detail. Those are all at the federal level. But the provincial level has also put in place programs unique to their own provinces. So it's a little bit of a bifurcated response.
Gotcha. One last, this one quick. This is something we could probably look up, but you might know it off the top of your head. Patricia Shade wants to know, what is Canada's largest export to the U.S.? Do you know that off the top of your head?
Yeah, so it's manufacturing writ large. So when you break it down, it's plastics, it's automotive parts, it's everything to do with manufacturing, and then agriculture. So those are our two main exports to the United States. When you talk about goods,
Right.
when you talk about services, professional services is right up there as well. And then more and more the IT sector, what we call the ICT sector, information communication and technology sector, is also fast becoming a big services export, trailing probably behind tourism.
Can I jump in with a question about agricultural exports to the United States from Canada?
Yeah.
I know there's a number of 6th grade teachers on this call who teach, about Canada in 6th grade.
Yes.
I'm guessing a lot of 6th grade students may not realize that Canada produces a lot of agricultural goods.
Yeah.
So can you talk specifically about what kinds of goods, like you mentioned strawberries year-round in Canada? Obviously, you're not sending us strawberries. What kind of agricultural
blueberries,
goods
though,
our way?
Yeah, so we have a huge export market when it comes to beef and pork in particular. So that is a main export market from Canada to the world. Potatoes, so I buy my potatoes here in I won't say supermarket, in a supermarket, and the potatoes come from Canada, in fact, actually. So everything to do with potatoes and grains in particular is a big export market, export opportunity for Canada as well. And we export a lot of grains as well around the world.
Okay. Chris, any final questions?
No, I think we are good to go on the teacher chat, and we are right up on 2 o'clock.
Can you tell us about the maple syrup market?
Yeah.
It's really good. And the best place, I know I have my chat open, sorry, how do I close that? I buy my maple syrup actually at Trader Joe's, and I said the name of the store, sorry. Anyway, I buy my maple syrup at Trader Joe's. And it comes from Canada. So either Canada or Vermont, which, is basically Canada.
Yeah.
So.
Well, Nadia, I want to thank you so much for your time. This has been fantastic. We had 49 teachers on this call, so we could not be happier.
Oh, that's great.
With all of this. You've added a little bit of happiness to our sometimes dreary lives lately. So thank you so much.
Honestly.
At the Georgia Council.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Thank you. And everybody stay healthy, stay safe, take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones.
And
yeah.
Thank you, we will. And teachers, if you enjoyed this, we very much appreciate your time. We have 2 more of these coming up on the book, so check out GCEE.org. We have one coming up on Japan. I have 2 next week, one Japan and one sort of Germany related. So
nice.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. I don't have a
Bye.
survey ready to go this week, so we'll just sign off. Thanks, everybody. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Bye.